Not only am I comparing this to South Africa in the 80s, I'm comparing it to a situation where I was working in townships and squatter settlements like Crossroads, where 70,000 shacks were simply burned to the ground. And I'm saying to you that even then, what I was seeing in the occupied territories felt even worse than what I was witnessing in South Africa. Why? I had never experienced anything like those checkpoints, where it felt like people were being treated like cattle.
Sam, you ready? Okay, cool. I'll start again.
It's fine, you can call me Keir. I don't mind. I'm not sure he would be thrilled, but I have no problem.
I'm just going to count myself down. 1, 2, 3. Good day and welcome to another episode of Unapologetic. Today with me is Andrew Feinstein, who is taking on Keir Starmer in a local election. Andrew, welcome to the show.
Thanks, it's great to be here.
Good to have you. Tell us first, just straight off the bat, just what's this election about? What exactly are you running? It's in some sort of, it's a very important part of London, King's Cross, but what exactly is at stake at the election?
So the UK is having elections on the 4th of July. This is obviously around the world the year of elections, but our one has just been announced for the 4th of July. I live in a particular constituency called Holborn and St Pancras, which is in Camden Town in North London. And our constituency MP is a guy called Keir Starmer, who is leader of the Labour Party, as I'm sure some people know. And he's been our MP since 2015. I've lived there since I came to this country in 2001. And I'm standing against him as a candidate for the British Parliament. And I suppose why it's a slightly unusual election is because as leader of the Labour Party, he is widely expected to be the next Prime Minister of Great Britain. But even if the Labour Party wins a majority, which is extremely likely because the Tory government has been completely inept, incompetent and corrupt for years and years, and the vast majority of people are sick of them, if his party won the majority of seats, but he lost his seat, he wouldn't be able to become Prime Minister. So in that sense, it's quite a significant election, even though it's just one constituency.
So you can kick him out of Parliament, basically?
Yeah, so if I defeated him as the Member of Parliament for the constituency of Holborn and St Pancras, he would no longer be a Member of Parliament and therefore wouldn't be eligible to be voted by the Parliament as the next Prime Minister.
Do you think you'll win?
He obviously has a huge party machinery with huge amounts of money. There are massive restrictions on what independents can spend. And to give you an example, my campaign is able to spend about £19,000 over the 6 weeks of the campaign, whereas his Labour Party can spend as many millions as they want. He's obviously a well-known figure because he's running to be Prime Minister, so it'll be incredibly difficult, but he's also not very popular. His policies are very similar to the policies of the Conservative Party in many senses. He's been terrible on Gaza, and we can go into detail later. He seems to have in his politics a sort of quite authoritarian, almost undemocratic streak to him. And so for someone whose party is so far ahead in the polls, he has an unfavorability rating of around minus 31, which is very, very high. So in that sense, yes, there's a small chance. But as important as the possibility of defeating him is the opportunity to show, first of all, that politics can be done in a different way. Politics doesn't have to be removed from the people who are supposed to be represented, first of all. But second of all, that people can actually just speak, if I may use the phrase, unapologetically about what one believes in, rather than changing one's position as often as a baby changes its nappy, and often for the same reasons, which is pretty much what Keir Starmer seems to do politically. And I want to show that, it's actually important to have principles and values and convictions in politics. So even if we don't win, I'm hoping that the campaign will show a very different kind of politics, but also give voice to the crucial issues of our day, which are the interrelated issues of what is happening in Gaza, with our government not just doing nothing about it, actually enabling, facilitating and profiting from it. And Keir Starmer's Labour Party has been no different to the government on this. But also how that impacts local issues. In our constituency, for instance, housing, social housing, is a huge issue. the state of the NHS, the state of the care system, the benefit system, education. There are all these issues, and they're linked to Gaza in the sense that our government is pouring billions and billions of our taxpayer funds into the companies who produce the weapons that Israel is using. Now, these are billions that I would argue should be spent on addressing the climate catastrophe, on addressing the fact that we have a serious shortage of adequate social housing in the area, of investing in the NHS, in our benefits and care systems. So the sort of issues that my day job is involved with, which is investigative research into the arms trade, into conflict, into genocide, and the local issues that face the vast majority of people, not just in Holborn and St Pancras, but across the UK, are very closely interlinked and related.
So we're going to get into a lot of that, and we're going to speak specifically about the elections and Keir Starmer and Gaza, but we want to kind of explore a bit about you and who you are. You are Jewish, you are South African, and you are now British, and you have a family history linked to the Holocaust. Could you tell us about that, but also how you ended up in South Africa as a result, I'm assuming, as a result of that?
Sure. So my mother was Austrian. My father was South African. His family were Orthodox Jews. They had come to South Africa to flee pogroms against Jews in Tsarist Russia. When he was in his sort of early to mid-20s, he got involved with a non-Jewish woman. So the only way my grandmother dealt with it was to send him away from South Africa for a time to London, because she was so appalled by this notion. And when he was in London, he met my mother. The difficulty was my mother came from a very working class Viennese background, and he then took her back to South Africa. And I'm not sure which my grandmother thought was worse, a non-Jewish person or a Jewish person but whom was working class. And she never got on with my mother and never really liked us as a consequence, because we were her children. But my mom's history is she was 7 or 8 when the Nazis took over Austria in what is known as the Anschluss in 1938. And she and her mother were Jewish. Her father was not. He was Catholic. They converted to Catholicism.
And this was in the...
This was in 38.
Okay.
But that wasn't going to help them. Because if you looked Jewish, if you had a Jewish-sounding name...
How were they in Germany, though? Because
they were in Austria.
Okay, fine.
So in Austria. So the Germans, the Nazis, effectively just occupied the whole of Austria and included it into the German Reich.
Okay.
It was the first country that they occupied. And about 96-97% of Austrians welcomed them into the country. So this wasn't the sort of occupation where there was mass resistance to it. So many of the people, Jewish people living in Vienna at the time, were simply herded onto rail trucks and sent to concentration camps when the final solution started to take place. My mother lost literally dozens of her family. We're not sure of the exact figure. Over the years, my siblings and I have tried to investigate it, and initially we thought there were at least 19 who'd been killed. Now we think the figure might be as high as 39. And most of them were killed in Auschwitz. My mom, who was 7 or 8 at the time, was hidden in a coal cellar underneath their house for 3.5 years. And whenever there was a raid by the Gestapo or the SS in the area, she was rolled up into a carpet and the carpet put up against the wall in case the soldiers managed to shoot their way through the door and into the coal cellar. Fortunately, they never did. I took my children a few years ago to see, because the coal cellar is still there with the door. They're not bullet holes. It's an incredibly thick steel door. There are the actual bullets still in the door. So my mom and her mother, my grandmother, were very lucky. And that's how they lived. And then the part of Vienna that they were in, once the Nazis were defeated, it was in the Russian zone. Vienna was divided, like Berlin, into various different zones that different of the Allies controlled. They were in the Russian zone, which was also quite tough. There was an enormous amount of pillaging going on by Russian soldiers and various other things. And so quite soon after the war, She was in her late teens. When she came to London, where she worked as an au pair. And that's where she and my father met, at a dance club on Baker Street, as they describe it. They returned to South Africa together. So why is any of this of relevance? Well, there are a number of ways. The first thing is that I'm incredibly proud to be Jewish. I'm also inordinately proud of being South African. But those sort of labels of identification are fairly superficial. And I think it depends why one is proud to be Jewish or why one is proud to be South African. And in my case, it's very simple. My mom would disappear often very early in the morning before we left for school. And I was the youngest. And this used to irritate me a bit. I would just be told, sort out your own breakfast. And I'd think, this isn't the plan. And eventually one day, I must have been about 10 or 11, I said to her, Mom, where do you go so early in the morning? Do you have like a job where you start at 5:30 or 6? And she said no. And she tried to explain to me, and I only understood it a few years later. She tried to explain to me that when she arrived in South Africa, which was obviously an apartheid state at the time, she saw the vast majority of South Africans, black South Africans, being treated in ways that she thought were exactly like the Jews of Europe had been treated by the Nazis, as lesser human beings, as people who didn't require the same quality of life or to be treated in any way decently. And this really shocked her. I don't think she really understood what South Africa was until she arrived there. And she said to me that after the Second World War, in which she lost so many of her extended family, she was taught this notion of never again. There must never again be another Holocaust. But as she said to me, 6 million Jews were murdered by the Nazis, but there were at least 6 million other people as well who were slaughtered by the Nazis in the camps and in other ways for all sorts of reasons, because they were in same-sex relationships, because they had some sort of physical impairment, because they were Romani or traveller people, because they were left-wing, socialists or communists. So there were millions of other people as well. And she said to me, I never for a moment understood never again as being just about us Jews. I, of course, understood it as being for all humanity. So she very early on, after arriving in South Africa, got involved in the struggle against apartheid, specifically through an organization called the Black Sash, which was an organization of white women predominantly, who would stand on street corners from the crack of dawn with signs protesting against the worst parts of the apartheid system. And that's why she would disappear in the mornings to protest. So I grew up. And my dad, on the other hand, was sort of a white liberal in a very traditional South African sense. So he thought apartheid was wrong, but he wasn't really going to do that much about it. He'd been more political in his younger days. He belonged to something called the Congress of Democrats, which was affiliated to what became Mandela's ANC, or African National Congress. But my mom was more political. She also worked as a puppeteer. That was her profession. And she worked in an illegal theatre called the People's Space in Cape Town. It was regularly closed down. And there she rubbed shoulders with some of the most preeminent anti-apartheid artists, people like a remarkable playwright called Athol Fugard, who wrote a series of plays about apartheid. And he always worked with two actors, John Carney and Winston Chawner. And then there was the piano player who I met as Dollar Brand, and I thought he had the coolest name I'd ever heard. And he later changed his name to Abdullah Ibrahim and is possibly South Africa's most famous ever jazz artist. During my school holidays, as a primary school student, I'd be hanging out with these people at like 9, 10 years old and had no sense of who they were. And I just, I liked Dollar Brand because I just thought the name was great. And even then I started to love his piano playing, which I do still today. So I was very, very lucky that even though I grew up as a privileged white South African, and it's really important to understand that I had enormous privilege simply because of the color of my skin. But I was lucky in the sense that I also had access to people who thought that the system, even at the height of apartheid, was iniquitous and indefensible and had to end. And that played an absolutely crucial role in my sort of formative politics, if you will. And of course, like for many descendants of survivors of the Holocaust looms incredibly large in my life, in my psyche, and of course in my politics. So I suppose that's where my sort of family history is really important when it comes to my politics.
How did you start actually getting involved in the liberation struggle yourself? Start making conscious choices as opposed to just being in the environment of politics?
The interesting thing today is that you speak to white South Africans of my generation. I'm 60 years old. And it's difficult to find a white South African who supported apartheid. So I don't know who all these people were who kept on voting the party of apartheid back into power with huge majorities. Because literally now, no white South African ever supported apartheid. The reality is that there were very, very few South Africans who fought against apartheid, white South Africans. There were some very famous ones, people like Joe Slovo and Ruth First, Rusty Bernstein. Many, Beyers Naudé would be a name that some might have heard of, an extraordinary church leader. These were just incredibly courageous people. And they were shunned by white society completely. I mean, Joe Slovo was seen as a terrorist. He had to flee the country and lived in exile for many years. Ruth First, his wife, was actually killed by a letter bomb sent by the apartheid security services. Beyers Naudé, very brave, stayed in South Africa as a church person, a church leader, and suffered enormous abuse constantly. But these were people who had a moral center. And I was just, the fact that my mom explained to me why our situation was abnormal. And then I suffered anti-Semitism at a very young age, as did many Jews. My mom used to take us to football training some afternoons because it was like a half an hour walk and we were too lazy. And she had a little Mini. And one day there were about 8 or 9 of us and we weren't all going to fit into the Mini. So a mate of mine took a half-cent piece, which we used to have in South Africa, which I doubt exists anymore, but it was virtually no money. It was the smallest coin that you could get. And he flicked it onto the back seat of the Mini. And he said, "That's how you get 10 Jews into a Mini." And my mom was incandescent. I don't think I ever saw her as angry as that. His name was Gavin, and he said, "Gavin, get out of my sight. I never ever want to see you again." And I, oh my goodness, why is she reacting like this? And then, of course, she explained to me. And then she also explained to me about the fact that, black people in our white group area or suburb where we lived, at sunset had to leave the area and could come back again at sunrise the next morning. That you didn't see black people at night, and that white kids would call elderly black people boy and girl, and they would be doing all the most menial of jobs and weren't allowed on public transport. When we would go to the beach, it would just be white people. And then, when I was in my teens, I started working in black townships around Cape Town where I grew up, and squatter settlements, sort of informal settlements of shacks. And then when I went to university, I formalized that. I was elected president of the University of Cape Town's Student Health and Welfare Centres organization. And we worked across the townships of the Western Cape. And it so quickly became apparent to me that the ANC had the support of the majority of South Africans. We knew nothing about them, obviously, because they were banned and illegal in South Africa. And almost without realizing it, I sort of threw in my lot with the majority of South Africans. I befriended a family in a township called Gugulethu and actually lived in the family home for one particularly difficult period because as a white person, you also weren't supposed to go into a so-called black group area. So to be able to move in and out of this area, I actually stayed with this incredible family of activists. And that's where my politics were forged. I sort of got recruited into ANC structures without realizing it, which I think speaks mainly to my own sort of naivety at the time, where in the mid-1980s, the squatter settlement of Crossroads, which for anyone who's ever flown into Cape Town is that massive squatter settlement you see from the plane as you come into land, 70,000 shacks were burned to the ground by the military and the police because it was a very militant community politically. And I took 20 students with me and we went and ran a relief operation for them over a few days. And the police, of course, initially tried not to let us in, but we forced our way in, and then they wouldn't let us out. And it was really like a war zone. People were shooting. I even saw someone necklaced right next to where we were working, which is when a tire is doused in fuel.
I'm guessing this was the 80s.
This was the mid-80s. A tire is doused in fuel, set alight, and the person actually burns to death. And this was what was done to people who were called traitors, or what we called them, impi. And I once tried to intervene in a necklacing, and the guy who was doing it said to me, "Mlungu, white guy, if you don't shut up, you'll be next." And it's a horrifying thing to see somebody burned to death. So I grew up politically in those few days in Crossroads. But while I was there, someone approached me who later became our finance minister for many, many years, who was very active in the broad area that we were in, and asked me if I'd come to a meeting where people were just going to talk.
This is Trevor Manuel.
This is Trevor Manuel.
You actually resemble him just a bit, by the way.
You know what? When my daughter went to university, she has a very famous historian at Cambridge who was tutoring her at one point. And he said to her, "Isn't your father a South African politician?" And she said, "Yes." And he said, "He's Trevor Manuel, isn't he?" And she at that point didn't know who Trevor Manuel was. She was very confused. But a lot of people say that. Trevor wouldn't be pleased with that. We fell out later around an incident that I'm sure we'll talk about. But and he asked me to come to this meeting. And I didn't know what the meeting was. I just thought it was a group of people from the area trying to figure out what to do. I only later found out it was an ANC underground cell meeting. And also I should say, as a final thing on this, as to how I got into sort of liberation politics, if you will, the most important thing that happened in that meeting was not the instructions we were given, but we sat around waiting for hours and hours and hours. And eventually I stood up, and this is, in my late teens, white person. I said, "I hope you don't mind, but I'm just going to head home quickly, have a shower, change my clothes, have something to eat. I'll see you soon." And someone who I won't mention, who's now very prominent in our government in South Africa, said, "Oh, so the Mlungu, the white guy, is going to go home to his nice home in the suburbs, have a nice hot shower, put on his nice clean clothes. His lovely mother is going to cook him a nice hot meal. And then he'll come back here, and us black people will still be sitting here stinking and sweating." And I cannot tell you the embarrassment I felt at my own sense of white privilege that I was completely unaware of. It's probably the most important lesson I've learned in my life. But that's how I got involved in the liberation struggle and in politics.
So you're 30 years old when South Africa became free in 1994. This was also just a year or 2 years after the Oslo process had more or less begun and was signed. Obviously, I'm guessing most people, especially of your age at the time, involved in the struggle, were very much inward looking and looking at the South African struggle. But also as a Jewish person, and because the struggles were connected, what is your sense then, at a very young age, of what was happening in Palestine? And what is your connection to that struggle before 94?
It's a very interesting question, because when I first started to engage with people who I later understood were in the ANC, even in those early days, when of course we were incredibly focused on the South African situation, but even then, people would talk about the struggle of the Palestinians. And this was all new to me. There would even, I never forget, there was even graffiti of what might have been Yasser Arafat, I'm not sure, with a keffiyeh in the township I was working.
It's probably Yasser Arafat.
Yeah.
Yes, yeah, there's lots of it there.
And I just thought, nice scarf. I didn't really understand. And I didn't immediately link this to Israel, to be totally honest with you. And as I sort of became more politically educated, my parents were Zionist. Not sort of zealously so, but they spoke about Israel. We visited Israel when I was younger a few times. I went to Yad Vashem, the memorial to the Holocaust. And Israel clearly had a special place for them. One of my mother's cousins, who's still alive today, well into her 90s, lives outside Washington, D.C., and still has the striped pajamas she was liberated in. She came out of a camp and thought her whole family had been murdered. Made her way to Palestine, which wasn't yet Israel, and discovered that her father had survived, and they were reunited. So these were the stories of Israel that I heard. And in the wake of the Holocaust, you can understand how this notion of a safe haven was so important for Jewish people. And my parents were certainly of that generation who still saw it as essential to Jewish survival. I had no idea that this state had been created not just on the land of the Palestinian people, but on the graves of hundreds and hundreds of thousands of Palestinians as a consequence of the forced removal, which is a word or a phrase we know only too well from apartheid South Africa, who had lost their homes, had lost their land. But even prior to 94, as I became more involved in the struggle in South Africa, that's where I was educated about the Palestinian struggle. And I've always had the sense of these two intertwined, almost inseparable struggles. Because for many highly politicized, what I would describe as progressive South Africans, the two struggles are interconnected. The PLO, as it then was, under Arafat, and the ANC, under Oliver Tambo at the time, were close fraternal organizations that assisted one another in many, many ways. And it actually led to some very difficult discussions, particularly with my father, because I became very critical of Israel. And he didn't understand that criticism. And I would talk to him about Zionism and about the plight of Palestinian people, and probably fairly naively. I mean, I was young. And he would get quite angry. My mum never got angry with me about it. So really, from when I became politically conscientized, from my late teens, I started to learn about the Palestinian struggle just as I started to understand our own struggle against apartheid.
You mentioned you went to Israel as a kid a few times. What were those visits like? How old were you? Where did you go? What did you see?
So the one that I remember most was probably when I was about 11, I would guess, maybe 12. No, I think probably 11. And the first place we visited was Yad Vashem, which is the memorial to the Holocaust. And it was devastating when you see in very graphic images the suffering that people endured, the dehumanization of an entire people because of their ethnicity. Because being Jewish for some people is religious, but for all Jews it is an ethnicity as well, even for those Jews who are not people of faith, and I include myself amongst them. And to experience it with my mother, who would describe her own situation. As a child, you can only take some of it in, but it leaves an indelible impression on... I studied a lot of clinical psychology to stay out of the apartheid military, and it leaves an indelible impression on your unconscious. These are images you can never unsee. And even at that young age, I thought to myself, how can human beings behave like this towards other human beings? It made no sense to me. And I didn't understand the politics behind it, really. My mom claims, but we must remember she was a Jewish mother. She claims that at age 12, I read a book called Inside the Mind of Adolf Hitler. I'm not convinced. It might have been about 15 or 16 rather than 12. Because and one of the reasons I became so interested in psychology was to try and understand how human beings could be so evil to other human beings. So it had a huge impact on me. Israel itself, to be honest with you, it's not a country or a society that I particularly related to, even as a kid. I mean, there were parts of it that I enjoyed. You know, you could go to the beach, but the beaches are nothing like as nice as in South Africa. It felt like quite a stressed society to me. It felt like quite an aggressive society. And I found quite a lot of the people I came into contact with sort of quite arrogant and, I mean, I know this is a slightly silly word to use, but macho. And this is as a kid. So those were my early impressions of Israel. And there was certainly no political analysis going on at that stage. But that's how I experienced it first.
Did you come into touch with any Palestinians when you were there, or was this one visit, or did you go again when you were older?
I went 2 or 3 times with my parents. I don't recall ever having contact with a Palestinian on those visits. I then went again when I was in my 20s, by which time I'd obviously become highly politicized, and I actually went through Israel to get into the territories. And that's the occupied Palestinian territories, obviously. And I remember meeting some young Israelis, maybe even younger than me, late teens maybe, having a great time on the beach and asking them about their experience of Palestinians, because by this time I'd become fairly politicized. And I mean, there were people living, a few miles away from occupied Palestinian territories who'd never met a Palestinian. And the first time I went into the territories, to be honest with you, it was like in South Africa. I actually felt at home in townships. And with my sort of adopted family in Gugulethu, I felt much more at home in the territories than I ever did in Israel. People were incredibly warm and welcoming. There is a culture of hospitality, particularly around food. And, whoever you met, they were quite offended if you didn't come into their home and eat food with them. And without even knowing your politics, I mean, maybe they assume because you're in the territories you have certain politics, and I came to understand the reality of daily Palestinian life and of the militarization of Palestinian life, of the brutality and various aspects of the nature of the oppression that felt to me exactly like our apartheid system at home, except in certain respects it felt more brutal. So to give you one example, the first time...
Even then?
Even then.
And this is compared to South Africa in the 80s?
Okay, so you need to understand this. Not only am I comparing this to South Africa in the 80s, I'm comparing it to a situation where I was working in townships and squatter settlements, like Crossroads, where 70,000 shacks were simply burned to the ground. And I'm saying to you that even then, what I was seeing in the occupied territories felt even worse than what I was witnessing in South Africa. Why? I had never experienced anything like those checkpoints, where it felt like people were being treated like cattle. And there were these young Israeli kids, obviously in uniform, with all sorts of weaponry, who were treating young, old, middle-aged Palestinians as though they were at best animals. And of course you saw interpersonal brutality in apartheid South Africa. Because I lived in a place like Cape Town, yes, I saw it in places like Crossroads. But not, people didn't have to go through checkpoints every single day, twice a day, to get in and out of the group area in which they lived. I had been to Bantustans, our little homelands that were scattered around South Africa that all blacks were supposed to live in, but of course didn't. There weren't checkpoints between South Africa and the homelands. I'd never seen something so immediately dehumanizing. And I think that's why I thought there's a feeling to this that is even worse than our horrible reality at home. And then obviously I started to feel, I met some extraordinary Jewish Israelis. And one of them who left an indelible impression on me is a journalist called Amira Haas, daughter of Holocaust survivors. Still, I think, might work for Haaretz, the Israeli newspaper. Lived for many years in Gaza and for a time on the West Bank. And just talking to someone like Amira about what it is to be an Israeli Jew, but to feel totally engaged in the struggle of the Palestinian people, I think it actually helped me a little bit. And I know this sounds really self-indulgent, but dealing with the fact that in South Africa, as a young white South African who was already committed to our struggle for liberation, I wasn't shunned in my university community, for instance. There were a lot of progressive students who were great to be around, and we worked together in townships and things. But in the society more generally, even amongst my own extended family, people who simply would not understand why I was getting involved in politics, particularly in black townships. I mean, I once had an uncle who, after I'd been kept against my will in Crossroads for a number of days, when I got out and I arrived home, he happened to be there, and he said to me, "What's the matter with you? Are you on drugs?" And I said, "Why? What do you mean?" And he said, "Why are you getting involved in this stuff?" Because there'd been some media coverage of it. He said to me, "Just be grateful that it's the Schwarzes this time and not us. In other words, that it's the blacks this time and not us." And I looked at this guy and I thought, oh my gosh, I didn't realize that within our own family there was such overtly racist people. And in the broader society, if as a white person, and this is no great suffering, don't get me wrong, this is not some great trauma. As a white person who identified with the liberation struggle in whatever ways, there were people who just didn't get it and thought you were a bit nuts, frankly. But talking to someone like Amira, who again, there were many segments of Israeli society who completely shun the many brave Israeli Jews who are against occupation, who are part of the Palestinian struggle for liberation, and seeing the work some of these people did. Amira is an extraordinary writer and a witness to what has been happening in the occupied territories for decades and decades. It helped me think, maybe what I'm doing at home is the right thing to be doing. Because again, I could see, the parallels with the struggles, and I felt at one with both struggles. So seeing somebody who is an Israeli Jewish person taking a position not dissimilar to the position a few whites were taking in South Africa, it's nice to know that you are not, and I put this in inverted commas, abnormal. That it's actually a good thing to participate in the struggle of those who are being oppressed, even if in terms of your superficial identity, you are one of the oppressors.
So 1994, let's go back to 94 now.
Yep.
You are in the government, or not immediately in 94. I think you go into government in 97.
No, I went into government in 94. I was elected to the Gauteng legislature, and completely unconstitutionally there. We were creating new provincial governments. We'd had 5 provinces, which we expanded to 9. I chaired the Finance and Economics Committee in the Gauteng legislature, our provincial parliament, in addition to which I acted as an economic advisor to the Premier of the province and to the Finance and Economics Minister of the province. Plus, I set up and ran the finance and economics ministry and department. So as a member of the provincial legislature, I was holding myself to account, playing a role in the executive, playing a role in setting up, the daily sort of officialdom of government. So for a year or so, it was a bit surreal, and we had to do all these multiple tasks. Very few of us had a background in economics. So I spent just over a year there, and then the president, actually while we were at Davos at the World Economic Forum, in his hotel room when he arrived, I went into...
This is Mandela.
This is Nelson Mandela. Tokyo Sexwale, my boss, the premier of Gauteng, who was very close to Mandela. I think Mandela in some ways saw him as a son at one point. Tokyo took me to a meeting with the president, and I didn't understand why I was going, because I just wrote his economic speeches for Tokyo. So why I was along for this meeting, I didn't understand. And literally the president in a tiny room. Swiss hotels tend to be quite small, especially in places like Davos. It shocked me a bit. In a tiny room, he was sitting there in his yellow pajamas on his bed. He had just arrived, and he was obviously very tired. And he and Tokyo spoke a bit. And then the president looked at me and he said, Comrade Andrew, how do you feel about moving to Cape Town? And I said to him, Mr. President, I was then based in Johannesburg, where the legislature was. Mr. President, I'm from Cape Town, so yes, I would seriously consider moving to Cape Town, but I'd need to consult my partner because she has a job in Johannesburg. And he said, okay. And then he and Tokyo carried on talking for a long time. And then as we were leaving, when they were finished their conversation, the president said to me, oh, by the way, Comrade Andrew, it's a good thing you want to move to Cape Town because you're being sworn into the National Parliament on Thursday. I was only due back in the country the following Tuesday. But this is how things happened in the ANC in the early years. You were deployed, and you didn't really have a choice in it. So the president moved me to the National Parliament to fill a vacancy on the sort of the economics committees, so finance and trade and industry and public accounts, those sorts of things. So I landed up as an MP after I'd been in the provincial legislature for just over a year. And that was an extraordinary experience. I mean, the Gauteng legislature was extraordinary, but the National Parliament was just incredible.
Okay, we're going to get into that, but just so when you leave government in 2002 because you're disenchanted.
End of 2001.
End of 2001 because you're disenchanted with the arms deal. But in '94, before you actually start working in the government, what's your thoughts then? Like, what then, if you can go back, if you could just imagine going back to who you were when you were 30 years old and South Africa become free, what did you think South Africa would be in the year 2024?
So I suppose I worked as a facilitator in the constitutional negotiations that led to the '94 elections. Plus I facilitated a whole lot of other processes, something called the Soweto Education Crisis Committee, the Boipatong Reconstruction and Redevelopment Committee, after there'd been horrific violence in a township just south of Johannesburg. I didn't know really. I was just so focused on the short term that I don't think I would have thought what would it be like in 2024. I suppose I'd hoped some sort of thriving democracy.
I mean, by many measures, there's many problems with South Africa, but it's still pretty much a thriving democracy.
Of course it is. You know, we should never forget South Africa's democracy has huge challenges, some of which we might want to talk about. And, you know, I experienced some of that personally in trying to deal with corruption when I was an MP. But the reality is, you know, we must never lose sight of the fact that in 30 years, it's a nanosecond of history, really. We've gone from being a racist oligarchy, which we were from 1652, to being a functional democracy. And I would like our democracy to be better. I would like there to be a sort of a different demography to the political party situation. And I would like there to be less corruption, etc., etc., etc. But geez, you know, the fact that we are still a democratic state, that the vast majority of our people feel engaged by the democratic system, even if they feel disappointed by people they perceive as their liberators, the ANC, who haven't post-Mandela necessarily covered themselves in glory as government. I would have imagined a country in which black and white lived together harmoniously, and that largely has happened. You know, if you think about it, there wasn't no bloodshed. I mean, there were those myths that this was a bloodless transition. It wasn't at all. You know, in the Gauteng legislature, one of my fellow candidates lost her life because as she drove into the ANC's Gauteng office parking garage, a bomb exploded that had been planted by the far right-wing white supremacists. And simply because of the timing, her car was nearest to it, and she lost her life. There were other people who lost their lives. But my goodness, by comparison to what might have been, the fact that it was a largely bloodless transition is remarkable, and that the vast majority of South Africans across all the sorts of dividing lines that there could conceivably be have reconciled interpersonally, if not on the economic terrain primarily, which I think is one of our huge challenges. Because South Africa is probably the or one of the most unequal countries in the world today. I think that fact of reconciliation is extraordinary, is absolutely extraordinary. So yeah, I had this, slightly naive, utopian sense that we would be this non-racial beacon to the world with an extraordinary government of the people, that the people felt that this was their government and everything was done in the broadest national interest. And for 4 years we did have that, but only 4 years.
So tell me about, you were about to regale me with tales of what was so extraordinary in the parliament, but also tell me about why eventually you become delusioned with the parliament.
So, everything was done in the national interest. Nelson Mandela had decided he was only serving one term, come what may, which might have been a political miscalculation, actually. But it's easy to say that in retrospect. He wanted to set a precedent, that it's not about personal power. It's not about being a president for life. It's about contributing to the creation of a democracy that is driven and answerable to its constitution. And those first years, they were extraordinary. I could give you dozens of examples. I'm going to give you just one quickly. So my first role was to chair a subcommittee of the Finance Committee to draft South Africa's main public financial management legislation. We put this legislation in place, good legislation. And then my role was as the ranking ANC member of what's called the Public Accounts Committee, the main financial oversight committee. And we would look at all of government spending every year, very boring stuff. But if any money had been misspent in terms of the legislation we'd passed, those who had misspent the money were liable for it, had to pay it back, could serve jail terms, etc., etc. And the one incident that brought home to me how everything we did in those early years was a consequence of doing everything in the broadest national interest was President Mandela's ex-wife, Winnie Mandela, who was a very, very powerful political figure in the country. And she used to sit a few rows in front of me in Parliament. I was very intimidated by her. She had inappropriately used government travel for a family holiday to the tune of hundreds of thousands of rands. And my committee, which was non-party political, we just looked at the legislation and whether people had spent money in accordance with it. She had violated that. And so my committee ruled that she had to pay this fairly substantial sum of money back to the state. And I knew this was a politically sensitive matter. I wasn't the sharpest political tool in the box, but I wasn't stupid. So I asked to be able to talk to the president about it after one of our caucus meetings where all of our MPs would get together. And the president would usually attend those meetings. So for a few minutes after the meeting, he said to me, "I believe you want to talk to me." And I said, "Yes, I have a very embarrassing issue to talk to you about. Comrade Winnie Mandela has to pay this money back. And I'm not quite sure how we go about dealing with this publicly. and how we inform her of this, because I was the one who was going to have to tell her. And, the president immediately said, explain to me how she's violated the legislation. And I explained. And he said, okay, don't worry, I'll tell her. You just go and pass your resolution in Parliament as you have to. That to me was symbolic of someone. He'd never served in a Parliament before. In jail, they didn't have a public accounts committee. But he understood. He understood the importance of the constitutionality of our democracy. But he also understood that this young guy was obviously politically intimidated by his ex-wife and that it was a difficult thing to have to do. And he had no problem with, taking the lead on these sorts of issues. But unfortunately, so it was an extraordinary time in all sorts of ways. But unfortunately, it didn't last very long. His successor, Thabo Mbeki, who interestingly, Nelson Mandela didn't want to succeed him. But the party elders insisted. Mbeki had been groomed for this role. And Mandela and Mbeki, of course, had a very public fallout around AIDS and didn't speak for quite a while. And Mbeki wouldn't speak to the former president for quite a while. But Thabo Mbeki was much more authoritarian. Under Mandela, our caucus meeting would go on for hours and hours and hours every week because everyone who wanted to speak on a particular topic was given the opportunity to. Under Mbeki, either the president or one of his minions would come in and tell us the leadership line and how we were going to communicate this line and act on it in Parliament, and there was no discussion or debate. And this included on issues like HIV and AIDS, which we experienced a horrific pandemic in South Africa, and Mbeki was effectively an AIDS denialist and wouldn't allow public antiretrovirals to be provided through the public health system. And Mbeki wanted complete control in a sort of a Leninist organizational model where information wasn't shared except with those who needed to know, and was very suspicious of other people, and unfortunately was prepared to rubber stamp corruption if it helped the party and him consolidate his personal political power. And that's what happened. A report came to my committee about a $10 billion arms deal that our government had entered into, that Mbeki effectively drove. At least $350 million of bribes were paid. And that included to very senior politicians, including the defense minister at the time, very senior officials in the Defense Department, the head of the military itself, various executives in the state arms company. And I insisted that my committee should investigate this as we investigated everything else, non-partisan, just in terms of the legislation. And a lot of people came to us with additional information. And as soon as my party realized what we were doing in the committee, they tried to close it down. And various of the people I'd been closest to over the years suddenly started inviting me to dinner and to lunch to try to persuade me to stop this investigation. And I refused. And eventually the presidency itself said to me, you've got a choice. You can get rid of this ridiculous investigation and you'll have a career for as long as you want, as glittering as you want. Or you can try and continue this, and this is the date on which we can legally remove you from Parliament, and we will. And it was a moment of quite a lot of personal turmoil for me, because the ANC became like my family. And at one point, the Speaker of Parliament called me to her office with my colleagues from my committee, my ANC colleagues, and said to me, we've called a media conference in your name. And this is the statement you'll be reading out. And the statement basically said, sorry, we were wrong. This deal was very complex. We didn't understand it. There was no corruption. And I looked at it and I said, absolutely not. And all of my colleagues said to me, no, but Andrew, it's not just your political career on the line here. It's all of us. You've got to go and read this on behalf of the committee. The committee isn't you. And we're telling you to go and read it. And I was weak, and I went to this media conference and I read out this horrific statement. And the journalists, who I'd all been working with over the previous months, investigating this deal, didn't know what was going on. And I got into my car. I didn't take any questions. Got into my car, and I had to drive across Cape Town to a place where the full committee of all the parties was supposed to be having a workshop. And as I was driving over what was then known as Duval Drive on the mountainside, my car radio was on, and I heard myself reading the statement. And I just burst into tears. And I realized I just couldn't do this. So I got to where the workshop was happening of the Public Accounts Committee, and I got the guy who chaired the committee, who was from the IFP, a guy called Gavin Woods, who very sadly passed a few months ago. And Gavin was also in tears. And he said to me, "So it's all over then?" And I said, "No, I made a huge mistake. We're going to hold another press conference and say we're carrying on with this thing, whatever the consequences." So I called all the media from Parliament. They had to come across Cape Town. By this time, they were completely confused when I then said to them, "Look, this is what happened. I made a mistake, and we're going ahead." And I knew that was the end of my political career, but I also knew it was the only thing I could do, because I had to make a statement that corruption from the highest echelons of our government, even though we were a democratic government, was simply unacceptable. And it was a very sad thing to have to do. But to be honest with you, and I loved being in Parliament, that Parliament. And I could have happily spent the rest of my life there. But the reality is I would never have been able to call out any malfeasance or any corruption again. I would have had to sit there silently as our subsequent president to Mbeki, Jacob Zuma, looted the country in what we started to call state capture. And in that sense, I've never regretted having done that, even though some people in the ANC thought I was a traitor.
It's a fascinating discussion, and I mean it's enlightening. I'm sure for people familiar with South Africa that it all began that early, because usually the corruption part, Jacob Zuma and his presidency, which was very endemic with corruption, but they take the biggest rap on it. But then you moved to London, then moved to the UK. Why?
So that's an interesting. My wife is originally Bangladeshi. We were married in amongst other places. We got married all over the world, but Dhaka was the main place where we had 3 weeks of receptions, and it was extraordinary. And I put on about 25 kilos. But her family had settled in London from when she was about 8 or 9. And so for her, this was really home. My last few months in Parliament, I had to be placed under protective surveillance. There were claims that contracts had been put out on me, including by my own chief whip, who had benefited from the arms deal. I don't know whether there was ever any truth in any of that. And we had just had our first child, and it was quite difficult to live like this. And I knew that I wanted to write a book about the arms deal, because I had realized, I'd first thought that we had just been particularly silly and naive in South Africa, and that we'd been duped by these arms companies. And then as I did a bit more research, I discovered that this happens all the time. So, for instance, at the time that BAE Systems, the British company, was paying £115 million of bribes on our arms deal for one contract, which Tony Blair helped facilitate and negotiate. They were doing the same thing in about 7 other countries, paying over £1 billion of bribes. And I realized, so it wasn't just us who were naive and stupid, and that this is a very important part of how the world works and how the arms trade works and how our politics get funded. Because I discovered that, in fact, executives from BAE and other companies had been talking to Mbeki and Joe Modise, who was our defense minister, from the time of the negotiations, before we were even in government, about how an arms deal is the best way to fund your political party, and parties all over the world do this. So I knew I wanted to write a book, and I needed to get out of South Africa for a bit, because it was very intense, and I was mentally and emotionally exhausted. And we thought we'd be here for 2 years while I wrote this book. over 22 years later, we're still here, and I've written a few other books since then. But that was the plan. And Britain, I'd always loved Britain, and particularly London. You know, South Africa can be quite an insular place. It's far away from everywhere. It's not a quick flight if you're going outside of the African continent. And I traveled a lot as a child because of my parents, who were fairly itinerant. And London had always been somewhere that I'd loved. And obviously, when I met Simone, we were at university together here. When we met, and I met her family who lived in London, and got a sense of the Bangladeshi community, which I'd never really had much experience of, I came to really love the place. And so it felt like the obvious place for us to be. And also with a young child, having the support of lovely in-laws and brothers-in-law is also very helpful. So it was the obvious place for us to come.
So it takes you, I'm not sure if you're writing it for all the 9 years after you left South Africa.
Oh, no.
The book gets published in 2011, correct?
No, the first book gets published in 2007, a book called After the Party. And so I still go back to South Africa.
Which is also about the arms deal? I'm talking specifically about the arms deal.
Specifically about the South African arms deal. Yeah, the 2011 book is about the global arms trade.
Right, so
the first book, 2007, I go back to South Africa to promote the book. My publisher, a very, very good publisher in South Africa, thinks, okay, you know, maybe his family and a few others will buy it, which is pretty much what I thought. Well, I wasn't convinced all of my family would buy it, but I thought some of them would. And in fact, at the launch of the book, he says to me, he's unfortunately also no longer with us, a chap called Jonathan Ball, as we're walking out onto the stage for the book launch, he says to me, you know, there's a rumor that someone's going to take a pot shot at you when this book is launched. Which is the first I'd heard of this. So I said, oh, that's not so good to hear. And he says, no, it's great. It'll be really good for sales. So I thought, oh my gosh. And suddenly for a moment I thought, okay, maybe there's more to this than I'd realized. And the book became a huge bestseller in South Africa, which shocked the publisher even more than it shocked me. So I started spending a lot of time back in South Africa talking to sort of press clubs and audiences and a lot in townships about the book and about corruption. And initially it wasn't easy because in some townships, especially the youth movements, they saw me as a traitor. And then when they started getting concerned about corruption, they started welcoming me in. And I still do some political work in South Africa, and I love doing it. But I was working bizarrely, because some people sometimes try and describe me as some sort of, far left type figure. I worked in investment banking for over 5 years when I first came here, because my experience was in economics.
Working in investment banking and writing a book on arms deals.
And writing a book on corrupt arms deals. Within the bank, I was called the communist. And I found time to do both those things. And then I needed a month at the end where I was very lucky to win a fellowship to a writer's retreat and spent the last month just putting it all together. And then when the book was published, the bank didn't want me to stay on in their employ because they did a lot of business with the South African government. So my only real skill is actually at losing jobs. That's pretty much what I specialize in. And as a consequence of the success of that book, that gave me the basis on which to start investigating, researching, and writing about the global arms trade. And that led to the publication of a book called The Shadow World, Inside the Global Arms Trade in 2011, which did deal with the South African arms deal, but in the global context. It dealt with dozens and dozens of other deals, and was actually the first accessible narrative account of the global arms trade written since 1979.
I mean, the Washington Post it says it's possibly the most comprehensive book on the arms trade. Tell us the process of putting that book all together. Because it's a very different task.
Yeah.
And if you will indulge us afterwards, just you don't have a lot of time, but I mean, if you could just maybe give us two enlightening things or surprising things that the audience would think, wow, that would be very revealing, both in terms of surprise and importance.
Sure. I spent, because it was while I had a day job in banking, and while writing the first book, I really started researching for the second book. But because of the success of the first book, I was able to then put money together and get a quite good advance for the second book. So I was able to employ researchers, and I was very lucky to win a fellowship through the Open Society Foundation that enabled me to travel all over the world doing investigative work, interviewing people. And the book took about 5.5 years to research and write. And we revealed some things that had already been in the public domain, like the fact, but you'd be amazed how few people actually grasp what is in the public domain. The fact that Britain had done an arms deal with Saudi Arabia in which £6 billion of bribes were paid. And not all of those bribes went just to the Saudi royal family. The biggest recipient was a guy called Prince Bandar bin Sultan, who was at the time Saudi's ambassador to the United States, whose father also happened to be the defense minister, not coincidentally. He got over £1 billion in bribes, paid to his bank accounts opposite the White House in Washington, D.C. So there wasn't great stealth at that point, because people didn't do investigations like we did later on. And in case that wasn't enough, he was also given by BAE as a birthday present a Boeing 707 jet for his personal use, painted in the colors of his favorite American football team, the Dallas Cowboys. And your listeners will be delighted to know that at least until 2017, and maybe beyond, we only investigated until 2017, the British taxpayer was paying for the maintenance and upkeep of that plane. But in addition to that, Margaret Thatcher's son Mark received £12 million of the bribes. The Conservative Party received who knows how much through one of the main arms dealers involved in the transaction. This is all in the book, obviously. And that is probably the most corrupt commercial transaction in economic history. And the arms trade itself accounts for 40% of all corruption in all global trade. There are so many stories I could tell. Perhaps one of the more interesting ones that people wouldn't have heard about is probably the first modern arms dealer. It was a guy called Basil Zaharov, who claimed he was both Greek and Turkish, which at that time, when he was born, wasn't actually possible. And he only did this to facilitate selling the very early versions of submarines to both Greece and Turkey, who were then in conflict. He later bought newspapers, banks, and politicians. He was the original, people have this sort of caricature of corruption in politics, of people handing over brown envelopes stuffed with cash to politicians. And Basil Zaharov was the first to leave the brown envelopes on the desks of politicians. And one of the people he was very close to was Lloyd George, the British Prime Minister. And Lloyd George named him one of Britain's envoys to the Paris peace talks to try and end the First World War. And by all archival accounts that I've been able to access, Zaharov spent his time at the Paris peace talks doing everything to ensure that peace was as far away as possible, because it was very obviously very profitable for him, the war. He sold to all sides in the conflict. He had politicians on the take in all of the countries involved in the conflict. And as I say, he influenced public opinion through ownership of newspapers, managed the financing of his deals, which is the real role of the arms dealer, the political influence and the financing, through his own banks that he'd bought. And he really is the prototype of how the global arms trade still works today, I'm afraid to say. Instead of the brown envelope stuffed with cash, we have these incredibly complex flows of money through multiple jurisdictions to try and make it impossible for people like me to trace the money. But that's what we do. That's the skill that we as a small organization and not-for-profit have developed.
It takes you a few years after then, but you joined the Labour Party. Do you join before or after Corbyn takes charge of the party?
I joined just before.
Just before. And what makes you want to jump back into politics, and in this time, British politics?
I mean, I'd always known people in the Labour Party and in British politics, because some of them, especially on the left, if you will, like Jeremy Corbyn, were involved in the anti-apartheid struggle. George Galloway was another one involved in the anti-apartheid struggle. And we were always very grateful to those Britons, because millions of Britons got involved in the BDS movement, which was very important to bring about an end to apartheid. And I didn't really see it as sort of jumping into British politics. I saw it more as giving support to what seemed to be an emerging movement of a return of politics to, rather than making those who were the focus of the British state or of British state largesse, huge companies, super wealthy individuals, just the needs and concerns of very ordinary people. And I got very excited when the leadership campaign happened that Jeremy Corbyn stood in, and that he won against all expectations. It gave me a little bit of the feeling of 1994, to be honest with you, that here was somebody saying something profoundly different, that politics should be about hope, politics should be about ordinary people. And then crucially, something that Mandela reiterated over and over again, that you treat every person you come into contact with the same respect that you want to be treated with. And Jeremy Corbyn is a bit like that too. The two most difficult people to try and get from A to B with on foot, Nelson Mandela and Jeremy Corbyn, because they insist on stopping and greeting every person they walk past. Mandela was even worse in that if you were in a restaurant, if you walked through the restaurant, he would have to go into the kitchen too and make sure he'd greeted all of the kitchen staff, because he just believed that's how you treat people. So both of them I don't like walking anywhere with. Well, I didn't with Mandela, and I don't with Jeremy. But it was just a sense of a different sort of politics where ordinary people were being given more of a say in what our politics should be and how they should function. And I found that very, very exciting. So I was just an ordinary supporter of Jeremy Corbyn's campaign for leadership. And then once he was leader, I was involved, but in a very small way, in some of their thinking around some economic issues and some defense and arms trade related issues.
I mean, eventually Corbyn is now given credit for kind of derailing the Labour Party, and there's all of the, the slurs about anti-Semitism. What would be your response to that?
So I think there's, anti-Semitism, in my opinion, was weaponized. It was abused to try and bring down Jeremy Corbyn. Why did that happen? Because what Corbyn was proposing was a Britain that wasn't run by what is often referred to as the establishment, a very small ruling elite who control politics and economics in this and every country. He was a threat to them, and we saw that very openly with, you had very senior military leaders saying that there might need to be a coup if Jeremy Corbyn's elected Prime Minister. You had soldiers at target practice firing at photos of Jeremy Corbyn. This in a constitutional, well, it's not a constitutional democracy, but a representative democracy was a bit disturbing. So I think Jeremy Corbyn was seen as a threat. Of course, his foreign policy was a huge threat, very critical of Israel, very critical of the British arms trade. I mean, it was in his 2017 manifesto that they would immediately stop all arms exports to undemocratic, authoritarian regimes. And that's a huge threat to the British defence industry and to Britain's foreign policy, which I believe often runs counter to Britain's real interests. But to use something as sensitive and as important as anti-Semitism to bring someone down, to be honest with you, I've known Jeremy for a long time. The man doesn't have a racist bone in his body. He is probably, outside of the South African people who I worked with for many years, he is probably the biggest anti-racist I've ever worked with. He introduced more what are called early day motions into Parliament on anti-Semitism, speaking out against anti-Semitism, than any other MP. He has quite a lot of Jewish constituents. And, they tried calling him a Russian spy, a Czech spy. There's all sorts of nonsense to try and weaken and get rid of him. And somehow the anti-Semitism thing stuck. And the reason it stuck, I believe, has to do with the fact that he is highly critical of Israel. But to be highly critical of Israel is not to be anti-Semitic. To be highly critical of Israel in the way that I am, in the way that someone like Jeremy Corbyn is because, according to people like Nelson Mandela and Archbishop Desmond Tutu, Israel practices a form of apartheid that is worse than the apartheid we experienced in South Africa. And I take that from them rather than from my own experience, having been privileged under apartheid in South Africa. And Israel, even before the 7th of October, for 75 years has been engaged in a brutal and illegal occupation of Palestine. And the reason I'm critical of that is not in spite of my being Jewish. It's because I'm Jewish. Because my Judaism, which I've learned through my mother primarily, is a Judaism of humanism. It is a Judaism that says, because of what we as Jews have experienced for thousands and thousands of years, we have a responsibility as Jews to stand up against the oppression of any other people, regardless of who is perpetrating that oppression. And that is what made the mainstream media in Britain conflated criticism of Israel with anti-Semitism, which, by the way, was an explicit strategy of the Israeli government. They decided, when the boycott, divestment, sanctions movement was gaining a lot of momentum globally, that in order to counter it, they had to start labeling and getting their allies to start labeling criticism of Israel as anti-Semitic, anti-Zionism or non-Zionism as anti-Semitic. Now these are absurd equivalences. For instance, as long as there has been Zionism, which is an ideology, it's a political ideology, there has been anti-Zionism, which is also a political ideology. And both of those ideologies were developed by Jews. And there was a huge political and intellectual debate within Jewish society about whether the best way to safeguard the survival of Jews should be through creating a Jewish state or not. And today, as we sit here, there are hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of Jews around the world. There are Jews in Israel ranging from ultra-Orthodox to far left and quite a bit in between, who are anti-Zionist. These people are not anti-Semitic. They have a different political ideology about what is the best way to safeguard and create security for Jewish people who have a history of oppression, pogroms, and holocausts. So I must be quite frank with you, and I assume I can, given the name of your podcast, that I actually find it very, very difficult when I see people, some of whom have incredibly dubious politics, including race politics, using anti-Semitism for extraordinarily reactionary objectives. And the most obvious example of that has been in the sort of vilification of someone like Jeremy Corbyn and people who support him. And I think it is something that has not only undermined the integrity and the honesty of politics in Britain, but it has, perhaps even more importantly, it has undermined the unbelievably important struggle, and it is a struggle and it is an ongoing struggle, against anti-Semitism, against Islamophobia, and against all forms of racism and discrimination.
I want to start speaking about Starmer and also about the present UK government's response to October 7th and Israel's assault on Israel, on Gaza since then. But I think a better question to start would just be to speak about Israel and Gaza and the response to October 7th itself, because you kind of fit this unique crossroads of being an expert on the arms trade, of being an experienced apartheid and experienced liberation from apartheid, and is Jewish, and is also a fierce critic of white supremacy, which in a way all these four things kind of unite and merge to probably tell a story about Israel's response and international world's reaction to that response. What do you think's going on? What do you think's driving this really grotesque military operation? And why do you think we've seen so much silence amidst what is that many people call a genocide, and it's becoming very difficult for people to call it anything but a genocide?
So let's start at the end of that question. I've been researching and writing about and making films about the arms trade, conflict, genocide, violations of international law for over 22 years now. I have lectured at Auschwitz, where members of my mother's family were murdered, on genocide prevention, and I've written on the topic for the Auschwitz Institute. I believe that the International Court of Justice, in its preliminary ruling, felt there was a strong likelihood that genocide is being committed. But it was only a preliminary ruling. I don't need a court to tell me when genocide is being committed. I didn't in Rwanda, and I don't in Gaza. We are witnessing genocide by any definition of the term. And we have to acknowledge that. And we have to acknowledge that this is being done in front of our eyes, on our screens, every single day. And we have to acknowledge that we in Britain, as are people in the United States and parts of Western Europe, are not just doing nothing. We are complicit. It is our weapons, subsidized by our tax pounds, that are being used to kill Palestinians, including horrific numbers of women and children. So that's my starting point. Why are our governments behaving like this? Our politics, I think that global politics, certainly in my lifetime, are at an all-time low. You know, the tragedy of South Africa is not that we're any worse than anywhere else. It's how quickly after Mandela we adopted the very tawdry global norms of politics and economics and the intersection of politics and money. So in all of these countries where we are lucky enough to live in democracies, however imperfect, we live in the best democracies that money can buy. Because politics is all about money now. And how that impacts the Israel situation is that our politicians use what I describe as a virulent form of ethno-nationalism to set out their political stock. And unfortunately, Israel is the poster child of that ethno-nationalism. So Israel is close to, in alliance with, people, politicians, who are explicitly anti-Semitic. Someone like Viktor Orban, the Prime Minister, or he might have changed his title to President, I'm not sure, of Hungary, who in every election campaign uses the imagery adapted from the Nazi imagery of Hohenheim, who was this sort of Jewish silhouette with this huge nose, used to represent these avaricious, awful Jews. I haven't heard Israel call out Viktor Orban for his anti-Semitism. In fact, he regularly gets welcomed in Israel with full state honors. Narendra Modi, whose ideology is based on the philosophy of a movement that is avowedly anti-Semitic. Donald Trump supporters, who when they occupied the Capitol a few years ago, you had one guy holding up the Israeli flag, standing next to the guy who had on his T-shirt 6 million was not enough, which is the ultimate anti-Semitic slogan. The world is in a state of total madness at the moment. Total madness. Where we have the racists, the out-and-out avowed racists, describing the lifelong anti-racists as racist and getting away with it because of the complicity of our commercial media, which is owned by the very same people who benefit from our establishment economics and politics, and who want to maintain power as they do. In addition to which, as I said earlier, Israel has embarked on this strategy of labeling everything that is critical of it as anti-Semitic. And unfortunately, there are politicians around the world who are terrified of that, and who, because they don't think very deeply about anything, support Israel, as much out of fear of the consequences of not doing so, as because they are legitimately supportive of Israel. In addition to which, there are two political lobbies in the world that are the best funded and the most influential: the Saudi lobby and the Israel lobby. The amount of money those countries, and we can't determine how much it is because of how secretive so many parts of their budgets are. And I'm talking now as an investigative researcher as much as anything else. I have no doubt, looking at the outputs, that they invest significantly more billions than any other countries in effectively buying political influence around the world, washing over their crimes. And it's no accident that both of those countries, Israel and Saudi Arabia, have been involved in conflicts in which war crimes have been committed, in which international law has been violated, and in the case of Israel, in which genocide has been committed. So the fact that our politicians are reacting in this appalling way and simply supporting this genocide is reflective of the madness of our political moment. And the terrifying thing, to bring this back to the United Kingdom, is that you look at our two major political parties, and there is basically no difference between them when it comes to these sorts of issues. And if you look at who funds our two main political parties, you'll understand why they both take the same position on Israel, and why my own constituency MP, who was a human rights lawyer, who took cases around violations of human rights and international law many, many years ago, who now receives an enormous amount of money from these lobbies that I'm talking about, and who is completely acceptable to the establishment in this country, unlike Jeremy Corbyn. Why so many people are feeling that we don't really have a choice in this election. And what is a liberal representative democracy if there is no difference or very slight difference between the parties who you can vote for? And that's one of the reasons that I'm standing, at least to give people choice, to at least ensure that there is debate of the most important political issue and issues of our time, which is not just the genocide in Gaza, although that is right up there, but it's also the profound corrupting of our own political system in this country, and the misuse of billions and billions of pounds to arm these foreign wars, pounds that should be spent on people's needs in their own localities as they continue to face a cost of living crisis. But all we are offered is permanent austerity, forever wars, and the climate and socio-economic consequences of that.
When you see Joe Biden's reaction from repeating lies of the Israeli state, and you see both the Labour and Tory response as well, and the language they use, in a way, it's almost a repetition of the question I've had, but just I want to hone in on it more. How much do you think of that is a factor of, loyalty to lobby groups or interests, or which include the arms trade, and how much of it is just pure and simple white supremacy and racism playing out? It's obviously a combination, but just in your reading,
it truly astonishes me how racist our politics are in countries like the United States, the United Kingdom, and parts of Western Europe. In this country, Britain, I believe Islamophobia, which has been increasing alarmingly since the 7th of October, much like anti-Semitism. The difference between the two is that anti-Semitism is rightly criticized by the government and the opposition, often at the wrong targets, whereas Islamophobia is almost promoted by the state in this country. And that scares me. That really scares me. Because this idea of otherness, which is always attractive to politicians, if you can't give people anything to vote for, you can't give them a sense of hope, you are not going to help make their daily lives easier. You can give them something to vote against. And how do you do that? The easiest way to do that is to create this notion of the other. So look at that speech that Rishi Sunak made outside of number 10 Downing Street. Not the speech in which he got soaked in the rain, but the speech before that, which was a harangue, where he was talking about, these marches, which has been a place of calling for peace, of actually showing such a sense of community and commonality amongst people of extraordinary differences and diversity, and which have been an incredible honor and pleasure to be a part of, calling them hate marches amongst other things, threatening various organizations, most of which just happen to be Muslim in nature and origin. This is the creation of otherness. This is the playbook both of the settler colonialism that we saw in apartheid South Africa and apartheid Israel. This is the stock in trade, ironically, because it was a prime minister of color saying these things, of white supremacy. And white supremacy isn't quite the right phrase anymore, because we are seeing some of these ethno-nationalist leaders in countries like India and elsewhere, who are people of color, but who are on the side of an oligarchy, a people who control the economics and politics of our society. And I don't want to come across as some sort of conspiracy theorist. I want people to read my work to see how dense it is. I don't think that there are groups of men from across the world who meet in smoke-filled dark rooms and decide how they're going to win and retain power. I don't believe that's how politics in the world works. I believe that power instinctively either knows or learns how to reproduce itself and ensure that it doesn't lose that power that it has. And that's what we have seen reached perhaps its highest point in human history in the moment we are living through. And unfortunately, if we compare the reactions to the invasion of Ukraine by Russia to what is happening in Yemen or what is happening in Gaza, because these are all illegal wars. I believe that Russia's invasion of Ukraine was illegal, and I think that Russia has committed violations of international law, possible war crimes in Ukraine. Some people on the left don't share my opinion. But as hopefully you would have understood in this time we've had to talk, I don't tend to go with an opinion that is the flavor of the moment. I have certain principles and values by which I come to the positions I hold personally. And that's why I believe that the Russian invasion of Ukraine was an illegal one, because this is an area of work I understand and I've worked in for a long time. And that's why I can say unequivocally that so too is Saudi Arabia and the UAE's involvement in Yemen and Israel's genocide in Gaza. Now, Is it because we can identify more with Ukrainians? Because they're European and, dare I say it, they're white? And the victims in Yemen and the victims in Gaza are people of color? I certainly hope not, but I can't rule out the possibility.
I mean, you said power kind of learns how to reproduce power. Is maybe power overreaching? We see with all these student encampments protests. There's been protests in London from October 7th onwards against Israel's assault. They're not as big as they were then, but they still continue with lots of momentum. And I suppose in a way that's why you're running, to tap into the disorientation that people have with power.
It's certainly part of the reason of why I'm running, because so many people have asked me long before the 7th of October if I wouldn't be prepared just to voice certain things in an election campaign, because I think people are feeling desperate. You know, in my own area of Camden Town, we have incredibly high levels of child poverty. We have housing situations that are simply unacceptable in the 6th or 7th richest country in the world. We have, and this is, across the country, the difficulty of people being able to get an appointment with a GP, of elderly people finding that their bus routes have disappeared or been curtailed, and they can't get around things that they've done for generations or decades at least, and that our politicians have never felt as out of touch with the people they are supposed to represent. 76% of people in Britain have wanted a ceasefire for months and months and months. Not one senior mainstream politician is prepared to call for an unqualified ceasefire. Even after the ICJ's interim ruling, even after the ICC has called for arrest warrants to be issued, not even after the ICJ's latest ruling, which tells Israel to cease all hostilities in Rafah, or Rishi Sunak, or Keir Starmer, or any of their shadow cabinet demand an end to the carnage that we are seeing. Probably in our constituency, 85 to 90% of people probably support a ceasefire. Probably 65 to 70% of people believe there should be an immediate halt to arms sales to Israel. We know our MP is going to do absolutely nothing about that if he gets re-elected and becomes Prime Minister. So yes, of course we all want the Tories out. They're corrupt, they're inept, they're incompetent. But now the establishment feels there can be a change and nothing will change. But that's not good enough for ordinary people in this country, and I think that's why there has been an upsurge of independence. So it's not so much as we're tapping into the real anger and anguish that people feel both about Gaza and about living hand to mouth, as they often do day to day. It's rather because of the protests and the encampments and the outrage of ordinary people that people from communities across Britain are prepared to say, okay, 2 years ago or 5 years ago, maybe I wouldn't have been prepared to put my head above the parapet, but now I feel a moral responsibility as part of my community to do so, to give voice to my community who feel they don't have a voice in the media or amongst the political class in this country. So yes, I do think that the ruling elite have overreached. And I think the structure and functioning of our politics currently is simply unsustainable.
What do you think will be your biggest challenge in terms of winning your election?
Well, we've already seen sort of silly, dirty tricks. I mean, Keir Starmer's politics don't seem to me to be particularly focused on building our democracy. To give you an example, in our local area, venues who receive money from the Labour Council in our area cancel events that we have booked for at the last minute. I think that getting Keir Starmer to have a hustings with all the candidates standing in his constituency is going to be incredibly difficult. I think having a free, fair and fully democratic election in our constituency is actually going to be difficult. And that's a terrifying thing to say about a constituency where someone is standing to become this country's next prime minister. So I'm going to say to all of the candidates that we should do 2 or 3 hustings where the people we want to vote for us have the opportunity to hear us directly without the media intermediating between us, to hear us challenge each other's ideas and the perspectives from which we come. Because that's what democracy is supposed to be. So I think that's going to be our greatest difficulty. I think, of course, all the nonsense. I'll be called a self-hating, anti-Semitic Jew. And, with 2.5 degrees in psychology, that sort of pop psychology is not just politically disingenuous. It's just intellectually so pathetic. It really is. And I have to accept that people who have what I would describe as a very reactionary political agenda are using these sorts of terms in ways that I don't think they fully understand. And I don't think they understand how damaging it is to use these sorts of terms. But similarly, as in South Africa when I became aligned with the ANC, even before it was unbanned, I would be called our South African equivalent, which you know very well, of the N-lover word. I didn't lose sleep over it then, and I certainly wouldn't lose sleep over it now. Because I have to trust my own political instincts, and I've been on the right side of history in the most important decision I had to make in my life, which was whether to support the maintenance of a racist oligarchy or to fight against it. And I feel similarly now. So I don't think that'll be the toughest challenge. However much, when it's aimed against me, I don't really have a problem about it. I've been called all sorts of things in my life, and that's of no consequence to me. When people, including in one instance a rabbi, when I first started mentioning the fact that my mom was a Holocaust survivor, said in response on social media, well, obviously she survived because she was a capo, which is the worst thing you can call a Jewish person. A capo is a Jewish person who, in the camps, worked with the Nazis as a collaborator to facilitate the murder of fellow Jews. And to call someone who you don't know a capo, and of course it was then, and she spawned another capo, she would be so proud. They can say whatever they like about me. But to call my mother, after everything she endured in her life, a Nazi collaborator, speaks only to the complete depravity of some of these people. And I would hope that in this election, where a lot of independents are standing on what I believe are very good moral platforms, deal with their politics, not them as people. I've never met Keir Starmer, despite attempting to as a constituent. Keir Starmer might be a really nice guy. I don't know. I just don't like his politics. I'm not going to attack him. I have to even admit that he supports not just the best football team in North London, but what, as all of us football fans sing, the greatest team the world has ever seen. We support the same football team. We're both human beings. I don't need to attack him or his family, and nobody else does either. We don't need to do politics like that. You only do stuff like that when you don't have a meaningful moral and political argument to make. So that's probably the biggest challenge we face, and I hope for the sake of British democracy that it's one that doesn't become an issue over the next 6 weeks.
This is going to be the last question. In many ways, you're running against Keir Starmer is symbolic of many things that are happening in this country and the world. And it's because of Gaza. I'm assuming you wouldn't be running if Gaza didn't unfold, in all likelihood. That's not the question.
I was still thinking about it before the 7th of October, but this was obviously made it, yeah.
It's not yet over. We don't know how it's going to end. The worst, I mean, by many people's standards, the worst has already unfolded. It may get worse. And societies, especially in the West, are splitting. They are becoming polarized and divided. What do you think the legacy of whatever unfolds? I doubt it's going to stop tomorrow. But I mean, we may see all sorts of scenarios. We may see some sort of justice. We likely will not. What do you think that legacy will be for the world, but particularly for Western societies and democracy?
I think whatever happens, Western societies, like America, Britain, obviously, Germany, France, amongst others, have lost any sort of moral high ground on anything. You know, when I see British politicians criticizing Russia for the latest appalling assault on civilians in Ukraine, as happened, I think, yesterday, who's going to take them seriously? The world will be laughing at them. And that's the tragedy. So, we have two choices. Western governments can finally see the light of day and that they have been on the wrong side of history. If that is the case, they must now, if Israel does not conform to the directives of the International Court of Justice, to withdraw entirely from Rafah, they must first of all impose sanctions on Israel. They must second of all immediately halt all arms sales or deliveries of already agreed arms sales to Israel. And if Israel continues its onslaught against Rafah, they must seek to have Israel expelled from the United Nations. Because that is the only way we can salvage the international rule of law. And if we don't do that, the reality is that we will be living as are the people of Gaza, the people of Yemen, and the people of Ukraine, in a totally lawless world. And for those who might be a bit older amongst your listeners, the Mad Max scenario, in which there is just anarchy and bedlam. And we won't have a leg to stand on when we try and say that is acceptable and this is unacceptable, because we would have enabled, facilitated and profited from the ultimate, indefensible, unacceptable slaughter of innocent human life. But worse than that is a world in which certain human lives are regarded as more valuable than others. So that's the choice we have. As a planet, as politicians, and what can we as ordinary people do about it? And I say this to you as one South African to another. I had to leave the country in 1986 at very short notice for obvious political reasons. The night before I left, as I looked out from Signal Hill over Cape Town, I thought I'll never see the city or country of my birth again. Because if anybody had told me that apartheid in South Africa was on its last legs, I would have laughed at them. 4 years later, the ANC was unbanned, and Nelson Mandela and our political prisoners were released. 4 years after that, Nelson Mandela became our first ever democratically elected president. So I always have hope. And what we can do to change the madness in which we are living is never vote for anybody who didn't agree to a ceasefire as soon as they were able to. Never vote for anybody whose principles, values, and morality you aren't sure about. That is the way, one of the ways, in which you affect change in the world. And then let us, as ordinary people, all of us as smart as each other, let us start talking about what we want our democracies to look like. Because what now passes for democracy is working extremely well for a very tiny minority, but really isn't meeting the needs of the vast majority of us.
Andrew Feinstein, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much.
Good. Thank